Bienvenidos al canal Verdad Enjaulada, donde cada historia revela un nuevo misterio esperando ser desvelado. Toma tu café favorito, acomódate y prepárate para sumergirte en un mundo lleno de giros inesperados y secretos inesperados. Nos encantaría saber desde dónde nos ves. Deja tu ciudad y país en los comentarios. Mantén la curiosidad y comparte la emoción con otros amantes del misterio. ¡Que comience la aventura! Chapter 1. The Garden Show at Heatherwick Farm. The annual Heatherwick Village Garden Show was, by all accounts, the most anticipated event of the spring season. Trestle tables sagged under the weight of sponge cakes and fruit preserves. Brass bands played beneath bunting-strung oaks, and gossamer clouds floated lazily above neat rows of prize dahlias and marrow squash. Even the vicar had given his Sunday sermon 5 minutes shorter than usual, so the congregation could arrive early and secure the best seats near the lemonade stand. Heatherwick Farm, perched gently on the edge of the village, had been chosen to host the festivities this year. The farm belonged to Colonel Geoffrey Luscombe, a retired military man with a fondness for order, roses, and long-winded stories about his years in India. His wife, Evelyn, was the very picture of practical elegance, always with pearls at her throat and a clipboard in hand. They had no children, but their nephew, Lawrence, had moved into the cottage by the apple orchard just last year, after leaving a rather ambiguous post in London, Miss Marple, who had made the journey from St. Mary Mead at the invitation of Evelyn. Luscombe stood quietly near the rhubarb pie entries, watching the comings and goings with that serene, bird-like expression that suggested she was thinking of nothing, while in fact noticing everything. "There's a great deal you can tell about people from how they serve tea," she murmured to herself, observing the young housemaid Elsie nervously spilling a splash from every other cup, and from how others speak to her when she does. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to the guests. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Hepworth, fussed over a poorly arranged bouquet of lupins, while loudly suggesting that someone must have interfered with the flower tent order. Mr. Bramwell, the village solicitor, red-faced and buttering scones with military precision, cast sharp glances at anyone lingering too long near the raffle table. At the far edge of the marquee, a tall woman in an emerald shawl, Miss Clarissa Dean, an artist newly moved into Rose Cottage, sketched the proceedings in charcoal while declining any and all offers of sponge. But it was Colonel Luscombe himself who finally commanded the crowd's attention. With one firm bang of his walking stick on the wooden platform, he cleared his throat and announced the winner of the Heatherwick Cup for Best Overall Display. To Miss Ivy Denham, he boomed for her spectacular gooseberries. A flutter of applause rose from the villagers, some delighted, others faintly scandalized. Miss Denham, an unmarried woman of 42 with a crooked back and a biting wit, stepped forward with cheeks pink and chin high. "Well," she said, taking the cup, "I suppose I must thank the worms for staying away this year." The laughter that followed was genuine, though not without tension. Several ladies exchanged glances. Ivy Denham was not popular, at least not in the way one wished to be in villages like Heatherwick. She'd once been engaged to a local schoolmaster who'd run off to Eastbourne with the baker's daughter, and ever since, Ivy had lived alone on the edge of the village, tending to her garden with almost obsessive precision. "She does talk to her roses," Miss Marple heard someone mutter behind her. like they answer back. The prize-giving continued, and the afternoon light mellowed. Tea was poured, chairs rearranged, and children wandered off toward the orchard for the annual egg and spoon race. But as the shadows lengthened and the crowds thinned, a quiet unease settled over the gathering. It began with the absence of one voice. Colonel Luscombe, who had been heading towards the judge's tent, was suddenly nowhere to be seen. He said, "He was going to fetch the final scorecards," said Evelyn Luscombe, brushing crumbs from her skirt and frowning. "That was nearly half an hour ago." A search was organised, polite at first, then increasingly brisk. Lawrence Luscombe jogged to the stables. The groundskeeper checked the orchard. Even Elsie, looking frightened, peeked into the rose pergola. It was Lawrence who finally found him. Lying face down in the potting shed, the colonel was dead. The constable arrived within the hour, summoned by the vicar who had left his teacup unfinished. Word spread quickly. "Heart attack," whispered some. "Poison," whispered others. The colonel had been in excellent health, and his boots, Evelyn pointed out in a thin, shaking voice, were on the wrong feet. Miss Marple stood back as the village gathered once more, this time in muted shock rather than celebration. A murder? Here, in Heatherwick? It was unthinkable. But Miss Marple had seen the look on Lawrence Luscombe's face as he emerged from the shed. It was not merely grief. It was something else, something colder, something unfinished, and she had not forgotten the sharpness with which Ivy Denham had glanced at the colonel when her gooseberries were praised. No, Miss M. Chapter 2. The Village Reacts. Sunday morning, the lanes of Heatherwick were humming with gossip, so thick and fast it might have been woven into the mist that drifted off the hedgerows. Colonel Luscombe's death, or rather, how he died. B had passed beyond mere tragedy and blossomed into a subject of speculative artistry. Miss Marple, still staying at Heatherwick Cottage under Evelyn Luscombe's increasingly distracted hospitality, found herself an unwilling but attentive audience to the swirl of theories that filled the village's drawing-rooms, shops and pews. "I tell you," declared Mrs. Hepworth in the general store that morning, "it was the gooseberries, poisoned. Ivy Denham always did seem the type. Poisoning one's own produce." Mr. Trigg, the butcher, scoffed. "No woman would do that. Bad for reputation." "No, I heard the colonel found something out, something improper, and was silenced for it." "You mean to say blackmail?" gasped Mrs. Ames, her hand halfway to a jar of barley sugar. Miss Marple, browsing a small display of embroidery, threads nearby, allowed herself the faintest of coughs, enough to draw attention, but not comment. "Well," Mrs. Hepworth muttered, lowering her voice slightly, "it wouldn't be the first time someone in this village hid behind a military moustache and thought they could boss everyone about." The talk continued as Miss Marple quietly paid for a small tin of mending needles. Outside, the morning was crisp and cool, with early daffodils nodding along the edges of the lanes like conspirators. She made her way to the church, where the vicar was just emerging from the vestry, coat buttoned tightly against the chill. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, adjusting his collar. "Tragic business, tragic. I'm afraid Evelyn's taking it terribly, though she seems more concerned with propriety than grief." Miss Marple tilted her head. Grief often travels quietly, Canon Smalley. Quite right, the vicar said, nodding quickly. Of course, the police have taken over now. A proper inspector arrived from Market Bardwell, Inspector Burkitt. Young fellow, firm handshake, unconvinced about heart failure. And you, Canon? Miss Marple asked gently. Do you believe it was natural causes? The vicar looked down at the gravel for a moment. Geoffrey Luscombe and I served together in a fashion, I in the chaplaincy, he in the infantry. He was many things, stubborn, proud, a stickler for detail, but not careless, and certainly not one to drop dead in his own potting shed with his boots on the wrong feet. Miss Marple nodded slowly, just once. She had noticed, too, the laces, one tied in a sailor's knot, the other loosely looped. After the service, Evelyn hosted a brief gathering at the house, mostly to quiet the whispers that had grown unmanageable. A handful of villagers came out of polite duty. Ivy Denham, wearing a stiff black shawl. Clarissa Dean, who brought a tray of poppy seed cake. Lawrence, silent and pale beside the fireplace. The room was strangely still, as though laughter might be deemed disrespectful, but conversation too risky to attempt. It was Ivy who finally spoke. I always said that Sheed was a death trap, she murmured, eyes fixed on her teacup. Damp, mouldy, full of rusted shears. Evelyn, pouring tea with mechanical precision, didn't look up. Geoffrey was fastidious. He wouldn't have allowed rust. Then someone else did, Ivy replied, not meeting anyone's eyes. Messieurs Marple caught the shift, not in words but in tone. It was not accusation, but something else. A provocation, Clarissa Dean, ever detached, set her cup down with a light clink. Death is always dramatic when it's close to home, isn't it? Lawrence, who had barely spoken since the previous day, looked up sharply. You make it sound theatrical. She smiled faintly. Isn't it? The setting, the timing, a village, garden show, no less. Miss Marple watched this exchange carefully. Clarissa's gaze did not linger, but Lawrence's did. He was staring at her now, openly, his jaw set. Do you think it's all an act? He asked. I think, Clarissa said, that grief has many costumes. Evelyn, finally breaking her stillness, set down the teapot with a rattle. Enough, she said tightly. This is not the time. Miss Marple gently folded her napkin and stood. Perhaps not, dear, she said kindly. But you know, it is curious how grief brings out not only what we feel, but what we fear others might suspect. There was a beat of silence. Lawrence looked away. Ivy sipped her tea as though daring someone to comment on it. Clarissa retrieved her sketchbook from the side table. Miss Marple slipped out quietly, unnoticed by all. That afternoon, the inspector arrived at the farm. Inspector Burkitt was young, clean-cut and methodical, with a notebook he consulted more than the people he questioned. We're waiting on the post-mortem, he told Miss Marple when they crossed paths near the stable gate. Preliminary signs suggest the colonel was struck, not hard, but sharply. Chapter 3. Early Investigation. On Monday morning, Heatherwick village felt oddly subdued. The usual rustle of domestic activity, the milk cart on its rounds, hens clucking from garden coops, the low hum of conversation outside the grocer's was still present but softer. as though the village itself were treading carefully around the memory of Colonel Luscombe's death. Inspector Birkett had taken up temporary residence in the vicarage's spare room. Miss Marple, staying discreetly at Heatherwick Farm, continued to observe with the gentle detachment of someone who never asked questions, yet never missed answers when they came unbidden. The first such answer arrived at breakfast, in the form of an absent teacup. "Lawrence didn't come down?" Miss Marple asked lightly. Evelyn Luscombe, seated at the head of the table in a stiff navy cardigan, poured herself another cup of weak tea, with hands that trembled slightly. "He's gone into the village. Said he needed fresh air." "Quite right," Miss Marple said gently. "Young men often find it hard to grieve in company." Evelyn nodded vaguely, her eyes not quite meeting Miss Marple's. Later that morning, while Evelyn retreated to the study with a pile of condolence letters, Miss Marple took her knitting out into the garden. From her seat on a bench beneath the pergola, she could see the path that led to the stables, and, beyond them, the edge of the orchard where the garden show tents had been taken down. Elsie the maid passed by with a basket of linen. Miss Marple greeted her kindly. "I do hope you're managing, dear." Elsie curtsied faintly. "Trying to, miss. You were quite brave, helping with the search that day. It must have been upsetting, seeing the Colonel. Well, like that." Elsie hesitated. "I didn't see him. Not properly. Mr. Lawrence told me to stay near the kitchen once they found him. Said I shouldn't be frightened." "Very thoughtful of him." Elsie looked down. "I suppose." Miss Marple tilted her head. "You don't think so?" The girl's mouth twisted, as though unsure whether to answer. Finally she said, "He's been strange since before it happened. Pacing a lot. Talking. To himself sometimes in the barn." "In the barn?" "Yes, miss. Not near the horses, though. Out by the old cider press." Miss Marple made a mental note. She had seen the cider press herself the day of the show. Charming in a rustic way, unused for years and covered in ivy. A perfect place for a quiet conversation, or a secret. Later, walking along the orchard's edge, Miss Marple paused to examine the structure. The press itself was intact, though rusted. More interestingly, a set of footprints led toward it, larger than her own, perhaps Lawrence's, and a scrap of paper, folded twice and caught beneath a stone near the wheel. She crouched carefully and retrieved it. A torn corner of a theatre programme. The Duke of Marlborough Players, one night only. With the name Clarissa Dean scribbled on the back in bold pencil. Miss Marple folded it and slipped it into her pocket. She didn't need to understand its significance yet, but she knew it had significance. By afternoon, she was seated in the parlour with Evelyn once more, both women quietly sipping tea while pretending not to watch the rain streak down the window panes. "It's odd," Evelyn murmured, stirring her cup unnecessarily. "How many people claim to have cared for Geoffrey, and yet I feel so alone in all this." "I expect it feels that way because the people left behind often surprise us," Miss Marple said. Evelyn glanced at her. "You mean Lawrence? Think he carries something with him," Miss Marple said softly. "Something weightier than grief. You know, I once had a nephew who played at amateur dramatics. Very gifted, very passionate, but the strain of pretending to be someone else every evening took quite a toll." Evelyn blinked at her. Lawrence isn't acting." "No," Miss Marple said, gently resuming her knitting. "Then perhaps I'm mistaken." Later that same day, Clarissa Dean visited Heatherwick Farm under the pretence of returning a borrowed sugar bowl. Miss Marple intercepted her at the gate. "Oh, Miss Dean," she said brightly, "I meant to ask. I found this scrap of programme near the old cider press. Yours, I think." Clarissa glanced down at the torn paper Miss Marple produced, her expression flickering almost imperceptibly before she composed it. "Yes," she said, reaching for it. "I've a habit of leaving things behind. Dreadful, really." Miss Marple held it a moment longer before handing it over. "The cider press is quite a distance from the festivities," she remarked. "Were you sketching there?" Clarissa gave a small laugh. "Sketching, sulking, something in between. I wasn't exactly in the mood for gooseberry trophies and bunting." "No," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "I suppose some people find it rather performative." Clarissa gave her a sharp look, not unkind but assessing, then turned with a brief farewell. Miss Marple watched her go, the theatre programme now tightly. Chapter 4. First Suspects. By Tuesday afternoon, the village of Heatherwick had neatly divided itself into two factions. Those convinced that Ivy Denham had finally lost her grip on reason, and those equally convinced that Clarissa Dean, with her charcoal sketches and stagey affectations, was simply too modern to be innocent. Neither party particularly cared for facts. Inspector Burkett, however, was increasingly drawn toward a more convenient target, Lawrence Luscombe. He was nearest the scene, had no alibi, and was clearly under some emotional strain, the inspector said that evening, leaning against the mantelpiece in the farm's small study, which had become an impromptu incident room. "And the Colonel's will, recently updated I might add, names him as sole heir to the estate." Miss Marple, seated beside the tea-trolley, raised her eyebrows. "Recent, Inspector, 4 weeks ago," Burkett said. "Apparently drafted after an argument with a cousin in Cheltenham who believed she was entitled to a share." Miss Marple murmured, pouring out a cup of weak tea. 4 weeks isn't very long, is it? Just long enough for someone to make a mistake if they were feeling rash." "Indeed," Burkett said, "and Lawrence had access to the potting shed. According to the groundskeeper, he was seen leaving the area not long before the body was found." Miss Marple nodded, but did not comment. Instead she asked, "And the clothing inspection?" Burkett grimaced. "One of Lawrence's jackets had a torn cuff. Fibres matched the fragments found beneath the Colonel's nails." "That does seem unfortunate," Miss Marple said mildly. "Unfortunate? He's nearly stitched up." Miss Marple set down her teacup. "Inspector, I hope you'll forgive me, but I believe you are investigating a tragedy with the urgency of a burglary." Burkett blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "There is something about grief, Inspector, that cannot be measured by access or inheritance or proximity. One must look at what was not said, and by whom." The village, meanwhile, was already circulating the news of Lawrence's pending arrest, despite no such statement from the authorities. At the grocer's, Mrs. Hepworth pronounced with certainty that the poor boy had snapped like his father did, though no one ever said it out loud. Mr. Trigg nodded sombrely, as if he had always known madness ran in that family. Only Ivy Denham when cornered at the post office by 3 ladies asking pointed questions about the Colonel's gooseberry compliment, refused to engage. "People always think the most obvious answer is the right one," she said briskly. "It's not. It's just the laziest." At Heatherwick Farm, Miss Marple asked to speak with Lawrence privately. They met near the old cider press, where a chill wind had begun to tug at the leaves still clinging to the orchard trees. Lawrence stood stiffly, hands in his coat pockets. "You think I did it?" he said. "I think," Miss Marple replied gently, "that someone wants us to think you did." He looked away. "You sound like my uncle. He said I was too sensitive, that I saw things that weren't there. Sometimes," Miss Marple said, "the sensitive ones are the only people seeing things exactly as they are." He turned back to her. "Do you know what it's like to be resented by someone you live with? To feel like every day is a quiet audition for affection you never quite win?" "I do," Miss Marple said simply. "That's why I never married. I saw far too many women of my generation become permanent supporting characters in someone else's story." Lawrence blinked at her, visibly thrown. Miss Marple smiled kindly. "But I don't think you murdered your uncle, Lawrence. I think you were afraid he'd cast you out. And I think someone else saw that fear and decided it was the perfect role for you." He exhaled sharply. "Clarissa!" "You said it. I didn't." He hesitated, then said, "They argued the day before the garden show. I didn't hear it all, but she said something about going back to London with more than sketches if he didn't listen." Miss Marple nodded. "That is helpful. Thank you." Clarissa Dean, when approached, gave no sign of unease. "I knew Geoffrey Luscombe wasn't keen on me," she said, brushing pencil dust from her lap. "He thought artists were parasites. But murder? Please, what possible motive could I have?" "You knew him from before, did you not?" Miss Marple asked. Clarissa froze briefly, then offered a small, amused smile. "Is that the theory now? That I came back for revenge?" "I find," Miss Marple said, "that people often return to villages for 2 reasons, a death or a reckoning." Clarissa's smile faltered. "Well, I suppose I should have expected better eavesdropping from this place." She stood. "I'll save you the whispering. Geoffrey Luscombe was once engaged to my sister. He left her, rather publicly. Oh, marry Evelyn. It ruined her. She moved to the coast, died quietly. And he never wrote, never called." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "That must have been." Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue. The following morning broke with a crisp bite in the air, and a thick haze creeping low along the hedgerows. The kind of mist, Miss Marple thought, that could cause someone to overlook what was in plain sight. She dressed early and ventured into the parlour, where Evelyn Luscombe had already laid out breakfast. Toast, marmalade, and, as was now routine, a silence so brittle it might have cracked under the weight of a single honest word. "You've not been sleeping well," Miss Marple observed gently, buttering her toast. "No one has," Evelyn said, her eyes not lifting from the silverware she was needlessly polishing. "There's too much whispering, too many stares." Miss Marple nodded. "And the press?" Evelyn gave a tired sigh. "They called twice yesterday. I've unplugged the telephone." Lawrence entered just then. pale but composed, and murmured a strained good morning, before heading out into the garden without so much as a cup of tea. Miss Marple watched him go. After breakfast, she asked Elsie if she might visit the potting shed. The girl hesitated. The inspector said no one's to touch anything. Oh, of course, Miss Marple said sweetly. But I have no intention of touching, only of looking. With the eyes of a gardener, not a detective. Elsie relented, and a few minutes later Miss Marple stood again at the threshold of the shed where Colonel Luscombe had been found. The room had been left as it was. A watering can overturned by the door, gloves hanging like shriveled hands over the bench edge, and a patch of disturbed soil beneath the high shelf. Miss Marple stood very still, absorbing the space. Then she saw it. Not a grand thing, not a dramatic thing, a small thing, out of place, and yet not entirely wrong. There, near the corner of the workbench, nestled between a cracked terracotta pot and a spool of twine, was a thimble. A woman's thimble. Brass, lightly dented, and unmistakably old. Miss Marple stepped closer, careful not to disturb it. She knew Evelyn Luscombe didn't sew. She'd said so herself just last week, when Miss Marple offered to mend a torn hem. "I send things into town," she'd said briskly. "Never had the patience for hand-stitching." And yet here it was, a thimble in a potting shed, in a corner where nothing else of the sort had any reason to be. "Curious," Miss Marple whispered, "unless someone else placed it here, or someone who does so had reason to be nearby." She left the shed and wandered into the orchard, where Lawrence was pacing near the ivy-covered stone wall. He looked up as she approached. "I'm going to be arrested, aren't I?" he said. "I do hope not," she said gently. "I didn't do it. I believe you." He stared at her, almost dazed. "Then why won't the inspector listen?" "Because," Miss Marple said, "he has evidence that fits a shape he already believes in. Torn fabric, a motive in the will, a nephew too close to the scene." Lawrence looked down. "And no one believes in accidents any more." Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. "Do you know, I once knew a young woman. Her fiancé died after tripping over a misplaced carpet runner. Tragic. But the police insisted on a burglary gone wrong, because surely no man would die from something so ordinary. But that was the truth. It was ordinary, and very sad." He said nothing for a while. Then, "Ivy Denham. She argued with Uncle, you know. I heard them from the orchard the morning of the garden show." "What about?" Miss Marple asked. "I couldn't hear all of it, but she was shouting something about lies and shame and finally done pretending." Miss Marple filed this away, a note among many in the quiet ledger of her mind. She returned to the house just as Clarissa Dean was coming up the path, a folded paper in hand. "Inspector Birkett asked for a list of everyone I saw near the rose garden that afternoon," she said, passing it to Evelyn. "I've written down what I remember." "Thank you," Evelyn said, barely glancing at it. "Miss Marple's. I caught something on Clarissa's wrist, the edge of a bandage just peeking from beneath her sleeve." "Oh dear," she said. "An injury?" Clarissa looked down, startled. "Oh, yes, just a silly scrape. I caught it on the edge of a gate-post yesterday. Nothing at all." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And still sketching, I hope." Clarissa smiled faintly. "With My left hand now, sloppier, but oddly freeing. When Clarissa had gone, Miss Marple returned to her room and retrieved the thimble she had carefully wrapped in a handkerchief. It was a clue, yes, but not the sort the police would recognize. It had no fingerprints, no bloodstain, no dramatic reveal. But to Miss Marple, it was unmistakable. Because while Evelyn Luscombe claimed not to sew, and Clarissa sketched with charcoal and wore no signs of needlework, Ivy Denham had once entered 3 years running in the Heatherwick Needlework Showcase, and she had won each time. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. By midweek, the air in Heatherwick was no longer merely heavy with suspicion. It was thick with a kind of bitter expectancy, as though the village itself were holding its breath for someone to crack. That someone, as it turned out, was Ivy Denham. The confrontation came not in the parlour, nor in the potting shed, but rather in the Heatherwick greengrocer's, where Miss Marple happened to be selecting a tin of baking powder when Ivy stormed in, cheeks flushed, mouth tight, and rounded on Mrs. Hepworth. "You've been saying things," she snapped. Mrs. Hepworth, caught mid-weighing of dried currants, stiffened. "I beg your pardon? You've been telling people that I had a history with Colonel Luscombe, that I threatened him, that I poisoned him at the garden show." "I said nothing about poison," Mrs. Hepworth sniffed, though others certainly noticed how close you were hovering over those gooseberries. "I won that prize fair and square," Ivy said, her voice rising, "and I've nothing to be ashamed of. Unlike some who hang around sketching everyone's secrets into their little notebooks." This last was clearly aimed at Clarissa Dean, who had just walked in, scarf loose around her shoulders and one eyebrow already raised. "I suppose we're naming names now?" Clarissa asked lightly. "Oh, go on," Ivy said bitterly. "Let's have it all out." Miss Marple, who had quietly stepped back near the sacks of potatoes, watched as something sharp and brittle passed between them. Not merely village gossip, but something older. Evelyn Luscombe, who had just entered behind Clarissa, stood frozen in the doorway. Her eyes flicked to Ivy, and then to Clarissa, then to Miss Marple. "Ivy," she said in a voice that held its authority despite the tremor beneath it, "this is not the time." "It's never the time," Ivy spat. "Never the time to talk about how your husband treated people like pawns in his little army of appearances. Never the time to talk about the girl he made promises to and then discarded, or the other one who vanished." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Another girl?" she asked softly. The entire room seemed to go still. Clarissa broke the silence first. "She means my sister." "You're not the only one," Ivy muttered. Evelyn looked sharply at her. "That's enough." "No," Ivy said, "not this time." She turned to Miss Marple. "Years ago, before he married Evelyn, Geoffrey Luscombe had a habit of spending time with young women in the village, promising things, leaving notes. One girl, Nancy Elwood, left town suddenly. Her parents said she went to London, but I knew better. She was broken." Miss Marple gave a slow nod. "And did anyone else know of this?" "No one said it, but we all knew." Clarissa folded her arms. "And so you've been waiting for your moment, haven't you?" Ivy turned on her. "And you haven't? You came back here with your long looks and charcoal pencils, pretending to be above it all. But I saw you that morning, Clarissa, at the shed. You weren't sketching." Clarissa's face tightened. "You don't know what you saw." Miss Marple spoke again, gently. "You were there, Miss Dean." Clarissa didn't answer. Evelyn stepped forward. Clarissa came to speak to Geoffrey that morning. I asked her to. I thought if she could give him some insight, some sense of what his past behaviour had cost, he might feel remorse. "You asked her?" Ivy said sharply. "Yes, I did," Evelyn said, "because I'd grown tired of the silence." Miss Marple nodded slowly. The pieces were no longer scattered. They were merely being brushed free of dust. Back at the farm later that day, Miss Marple and Inspector Birkett sat together in the Colonel's old study. He had taken to consulting her now, though not without the air of a man still unsure if he was being taught or tested. "I've gathered statements," he said, "but no one's admitting to being in the shed when the murder happened. And yet I can't shake the feeling someone wants us to believe. It was Ivy or Lawrence. I rather think someone wants us to keep shifting blame," Miss Marple said, "like a child hiding a broken vase by turning the rug every time someone gets too close." Birkett gave a low whistle. "But what's the motive?" Miss Marple looked around the room. Tidy, cold, impersonal. "Control," she said. "Colonel Luscombe held control over this house, this farm, and over the narratives of the people around him. Some suffered quietly, some pushed back. But someone decided it was time to stop him. Permanently." She paused. "There was a thimble in the shed," she added. "A thimble? Yes. And while that seems unimportant, I find it odd that a man like Colonel Luscombe, so precise, would allow anything domestic to clutter his garden tools." Birkett frowned. "So someone else was there. Someone who stitched a story together, but left behind a trace of the needle." That evening, Evelyn sat alone by the drawing-room fire, her hands idle, eyes distant. Miss Marple joined her without speaking. Chapter 7. Another twist. It was not a confession, nor a discovery, that turned the mystery inside out. It was a parcel. A plain brown paper package, tied with string and addressed in an elegant looping hand to Colonel Geoffrey Luscombe, arrived at the village post office 2 days after his death. The postmistress, Mrs. Plum, knowing full well the Colonel's fate, and equally aware of the whispering that now infected every corner of Heatherwick, promptly informed Inspector Birkett. He collected it himself and brought it unopened to Heatherwick Farm, where Evelyn received it with a faint tremble of her hand. "I didn't know Geoffrey was expecting anything," she said, carefully cutting the twine beneath Birkett's watchful eye. Inside was a small book, not a military memoir or garden manual, but a slim, faded volume of poetry. Tucked within its pages was a note. Miss Marple, who had been seated near the hearth, knitting untouched on her lap, leaned forward. Evelyn read it aloud, her voice steady but chilled. "You never answered, so I am writing again. I thought time might have softened you. I was wrong, but you owe me this much, to read it now at least. The truth is in the lines we never dared to say aloud." N.E., N.E., Evelyn whispered. "Nancy Elwood." Miss Marple said nothing at first, then gently asked, "Was this sent recently?" Evelyn nodded. "Postmarked 3 days before the garden show, from a return address in Bournemouth." Inspector Burkett turned the book over in his hands. Poetry as blackmail. Not blackmail, Miss Marple murmured. A reminder, one, that must have shaken the Colonel more than he let on. Evelyn placed the letter back inside the book and held it to her chest. He never told me she'd written. Never told me she was still alive. Lawrence entered at that moment, drawn by the hush in the room. What's happened? Evelyn handed him the book without a word. He read the note once and then again, face tightening. I remember her, he said softly. She used to walk past the cottage when I was small, always with a book in her hand. I asked once if she was in love with my uncle. She laughed and said she was too young for regret. He looked up. He told her to leave, that she'd never belong here. Miss Marple regarded him carefully. Did she? Leave? Lawrence asked. Yes, but not for long. Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the address in Bournemouth that afternoon. A neat row house with yellow curtains and a daffodil in the window. Nancy Elwood answered the door herself. She was older than Miss Marple remembered from the photograph Evelyn once showed her, but her eyes still held a quiet intelligence, and a wound long since buried beneath layers of practised calm. Heard, she said before Miss Marple could speak. The papers didn't say how he died, but I suppose you're here to ask. I'm here because you wrote to him, Miss Marple said gently. Nancy nodded and led her into a modest sitting room. I wanted closure, she said. That was all. I never asked for money, never demanded apologies, just an acknowledgement that what happened mattered. Miss Marple listened patiently as Nancy recounted it. The promises made when she was 17, the stolen meetings in Geolu, the orchard, the sudden crushing silence when the Colonel had chosen Evelyn instead, the shame, the loneliness, the way she had disappeared to save face, not hers, but his. He never responded, Nancy said, not after all these years. But he read your letter, Miss Marple said. He received the book. The timing was just days before the murder. Nancy looked down. I hoped he'd tell the truth. To Evelyn, if not to me. Someone in Heatherwick knew of your past, Miss Marple said. Perhaps even saw the letter arrive, and that someone understood its weight. That night, back at Heatherwick Farm, Inspector Burkett looked troubled. I thought we were close, he told Miss Marple. Lawrence had motive. Ivy had anger. Clarissa had history. But this opens the door to someone trying to protect more than reputation. Someone trying to bury the past completely. Or someone who feared what the truth might reveal, Miss Marple said. Shame is a powerful thing, Inspector. So is fear of exposure. She hesitated, then added, Evelyn's grief has been composed, but not natural. She has not once asked who killed her husband, only why. Burkett frowned. You think? She suspects. I think, Miss Marple said softly. She knows. The next morning, Evelyn requested that no one disturb her until lunch. She had taken to her room, claiming a migraine. Lawrence knocked once and waited. There was no reply. Miss Marple, standing at the bottom of the stairs, turned slowly and walked toward the garden. It was there, beside the old stone bird bath, that she found something unexpected. The Colonel's old gardening gloves, washed and drying in the sun, a faint stain of what looked like clay and rust at the edges. Beside them, laid out to dry, was a familiar fabric, a cuff torn from a tweed coat. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Final Test. The midday sun filtered through the lace curtains of Heatherwick Farm, casting soft patterns across the parlour rug. Miss Marple sat with a fresh pot of tea, her movements unhurried, the clink of porcelain almost musical against the quiet hum of the house. Across from her, Evelyn Loosecombe sat stiffly, a folded handkerchief in her lap, untouched. Her posture, as always, was impeccable. Her gaze, however, was far away, fixed not on the teacups or the garden view, but somewhere deeper, darker. "I'm so grateful for your presence, Miss Marple," she said after a long silence. "It's been terribly lonely, even with people always about." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Loneliness can be the loudest sound in a house, I find, especially when it's built on things never spoken." Evelyn blinked just once. "I often think," Miss Marple continued gently, "that truth behaves rather like a dandelion. One sharp breath, and everything scatters. Hard to gather again. Harder still to pretend nothing ever grew there." Evelyn gave a soft exhale, half scoff, half sigh. "You've always had a way with metaphors." Miss Marple poured more tea. "I find nature helps us say the things we cannot." She lifted the pot with delicate hands, letting a beat of silence linger before adding, "I found the gloves this morning, the gardening ones." Evelyn's teacup paused in mid-air. "Oh? Yes, laid out beside the torn cuff, and the thimble. Burned slightly, I think. From the fireplace, perhaps?" A pause, a shift of the eyes. Then, evenly, "I didn't notice they were still there." Miss Marple offered a smile that was almost indulgent. "Nor would most. But one does notice such things when one has mended one's own clothes for decades." Evelyn placed her teacup down with a faint click. "I suppose," she said slowly, "there's no use pretending, is there?" Miss Marple said nothing. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I only meant to stop him, to frighten him. The letter from Nancy." Her voice faltered. "I found it before he did. It was on the hall table, and I recognized the name. He would have burned it, like he always did with things that didn't suit his version of the past." Evelyn rose, crossing to the window. Her hands were clenched at her sides. "I confronted him," she said, her voice quieter now, "in the shed, after the show had wound down. I told him I knew everything. About Nancy, about Clarissa's sister, about the girl who never returned. I thought—" She swallowed. "I thought he would apologize, or show some flicker of regret." Miss Marple's voice was as gentle as a breeze. "But he didn't." "No." Evelyn's voice cracked. "He laughed, called them silly girls with soft hearts, said I was no different." "And then?" Miss Marple asked softly. "I pushed him, just to get past him, just to leave." She shook her head. "He tripped backward, caught the bench edge, fell." Her voice trembled. "There was blood. I thought he might wake up, but he didn't move. And suddenly I wasn't his wife anymore. I was a problem solver." Miss Marple remained still. "I changed his boots," Evelyn went on, "made it look clumsy, hid the gloves, tossed the cuff in the fire, but it wouldn't burn completely." She turned back to face Miss Marple, and her eyes, though red-rimmed, were clear. "I didn't mean to kill him. but I couldn't let everyone know he'd been brought down by a letter from a woman he abandoned 30 years ago. The scandal, the humiliation. Pride, Miss Marple said gently. Yes, Evelyn admitted, and rage, but mostly pride. The room held a long, brittle silence. Miss Marple folded her hands. You know, I must tell Inspector Birkett. Evelyn nodded. I know. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. Instead, she sat back down, straightened her skirt, and poured herself another cup of tea with hands that now barely shook. That afternoon, Inspector Birkett arrived with Leslie, the constable from Market Bardwell. Evelyn met them in the drawing-room, confessed without drama or embellishment, and handed over the gloves and the remnant of the cuff, which she had since retrieved from the ash-bin. It was not a dramatic arrest. There were no handcuffs, no resistance. Evelyn merely asked for a moment to gather her things. And when she left with the officers, she carried herself not like a criminal, but like a hostess seeing guests off after a difficult luncheon. Later, Miss Marple stood near the empty potting shed. The sun was sinking low behind the orchard trees, their branches casting long fingers across the soil. Lawrence approached quietly. She confessed. He asked. Yes, he exhaled. And I spent all week believing it was me. That I'd wanted. Him gone so much, I must have done it without realizing. Miss Marple patted his hand. Fear does that, she said. It buries us in shadows we didn't cast. They stood in silence a moment longer. Then Lawrence said, You always knew, didn't you? Miss Marple smiled faintly. I had suspicions, but it's not enough. Chapter 9. The reveal 2 days after Evelyn Luscombe was quietly escorted from Heatherwick Farm. Inspector Birkett convened a small gathering in the vicarage drawing-room. He claimed it was a matter of procedural clarity, but in truth, it was a balm. A way to offer the village the one thing it needed more than justice: understanding. Miss Marple was naturally invited. She sat with her usual calm, a modest sprig of lavender at her collar, while around her the cast of the past week's drama arranged themselves with wary expressions and hesitant posture. Lawrence Luscombe, pale but now at peace. Ivy Denham, hands knotted in her lap, mouth pursed but quiet. Clarissa Dean, still with her sketchbook in her bag, though she hadn't drawn in days. Canon Smalley sat nearest the hearth, muttering occasional prayers under his breath. Even Mrs. Hepworth had come, claiming she simply had to hear it from someone who wasn't Elsie. Inspector Birkett, standing stiffly near the mantel, gestured to Miss Marple. Miss Marple has been instrumental in resolving the case, and at my request she's agreed to walk us through how she saw what most of us missed. Miss Marple gave a small polite nod and folded her hands in her lap. The answer, she began softly, lay not in what was done, but in how those involved behaved after it was done. People always leave fingerprints, not just on doorknobs or teacups, but on the stories they tell to protect themselves. A murmur of agreement from the vicar. From the start, she continued, the death of Colonel Luscombe seemed too ordinary. A bump on the head, a man alone in a shed. But the boots, swapped, misfastened, that was no accident. Geoffrey Luscombe was a military man. He would never lace his left boot with a sailor's knot, and his right in a looped bow. Someone else did that. Lawrence exhaled softly, as if unburdening. The next clue, Miss Marple went on, was the torn cuff found in Lawrence's wardrobe. Too obvious, too conveniently incriminating. And yet no other garments of his were stained or out of place. I've raised enough boys in my time to know a guilty young man rarely stops at only a cuff. There was a small dry laugh from Ivy Denham. But the real key, Miss Marple said, was the thimble. Heads turned. Yes, a small thing, easy to overlook. But I found one in the potting shed, dented and old. A woman's thimble, certainly. Later, I found another by the laundry line, slightly scorched. The kind used not in embroidery, but in mending. Something one does when they're trying to cover up a mistake, rather than make something new. Clarissa's brows knit. But Evelyn didn't sew. She said so, yes, Miss Marple agreed. But she mended, and she tried to mend that afternoon. Not a sleeve, but a story. She looked toward Lawrence now. It was your aunt, Lawrence. She didn't plan it. But when she saw what had happened, saw the man she had once admired lie still and silent, she acted not out of cruelty, but from habit. A lifetime of managing appearances, of ensuring nothing shameful could bloom into public ruin. Lawrence closed his eyes. She said he laughed at her, that he didn't think any of it mattered. Miss Marple nodded slowly. He made many women feel that way. She turned next to Clarissa. You confronted him too, didn't you? Clarissa met her gaze. Yes, but I left him alive. And you didn't come forward immediately. Clarissa looked away, because I feared it would ruin me. Or worse, ruin the truth of what he'd done to my sister. Miss Marple's voice softened. And Ivy? Ivy Denham straightened. I hated the man, yes. I hated how he walked through the village like a saint when he'd left wreckage in his wake. But I didn't kill him. No, Miss Marple said. But you helped reveal who did, with your gooseberries. Ivy blinked. I beg your pardon. At the garden show, Miss Marple explained, Colonel Luscombe praised your fruit. But what caught my attention was your reply. You said, I suppose I must thank the worms for staying away this year. Not many people mention worms when accepting an award, unless they've been keeping a very close eye on the soil. There were puzzled looks all around. Miss Marple smiled faintly, which made me think someone else had been keeping a close eye on things too. Someone who couldn't let anything rot too close to the surface. She looked back to Inspector Birkett. Colonel Luscombe was not a man of remorse, but he was, in his own way, exacting. Evelyn lived for his order, and when Nancy Elwood's letter arrived, a reminder of the one story she couldn't sweep away, it all collapsed. She hid the letter? Ivy asked. Miss Marple nodded. She intercepted it, confronted him. They argued. He laughed. She pushed. He fell. She panicked. And then she tidied. The gloves, the boots, the torn cuff, the cleaned bench. She mended. The scene. Just as she had mended his reputation for years. Clarissa folded her arms. She always looked so composed. Chapter 10. Aftermath. A week passed, and Heatherwick began to stitch itself together again, though some seams would always show. The Garden Show Committee resumed their meetings, tentatively discussing whether next year's event should be hosted on the green instead of a private residence. Just as a precaution, murmured Mrs. Hepworth, not quite clarifying whether the concern was structural or moral. Ivy Denham, though cleared of any suspicion, returned to tending her boarders with the same fierce solitude as before, refusing kind offers of tea or company. Clarissa Dean, whose presence had unsettled so many, left quietly one morning with nothing more than a small suitcase and a note left for Lawrence. He never revealed what it said. Evelyn Luscombe remained in police custody at Market Bardwell, awaiting formal arraignment. Her solicitor had indicated she would not contest the charges, a quiet resolution for a woman who had spent decades carefully avoiding spectacle. At Heatherwick Farm, Lawrence stayed on. He had taken to working the land in earnest, turning over flower beds and rebuilding the crumbling stone wall near the orchard. Miss Marple watched him once from the window and thought with something close to hope that he might finally be planting something of his own. On her final day in the village, Miss Marple visited the vicarage one last time. Canon Smalley offered her a second slice of ginger cake, which she accepted with polite reluctance and considerable grace. "You know," he said between bites, "I still find it hard to reconcile. Mrs. Luscombe always seemed so proper." Miss Marple smiled. "The most proper people, Canon, are often those who have spent a lifetime arranging their lives, so no one sees the mess beneath. They don't break easily, but when they do, it's not the crack that shocks, it's how quiet the break sounds." Jedishid. Vicar looked thoughtfully into his tea. Miss Marple returned to St. Mary Mead that evening, the train rattling comfortably past fields and fading hedgerows. She brought no souvenirs, but her mind was busy with threads she was still gently knotting closed. Back in her sitting room, with her fire lit and her knitting basket returned to its usual place, she penned a brief letter to Inspector Burkett. "Dear Inspector, thank you for your professional courtesy and your willingness to listen to the observations of an elderly lady with more memory than credentials. I hope you'll not forget, murder, in villages especially, is rarely about the crime. It's about the people. Yours sincerely, Jane Marple." She sealed the envelope and set it aside. Then, reaching into her bag, she pulled out the little thimble, the scorched one, the final detail that had led her to Evelyn's door. She turned it over in her fingers thoughtfully. Miss Marple never believed in trophies, but some items, like memories, had a way of surviving even when the world tried to discard them. She placed it gently in a wooden keepsake box, among pressed violets, faded theatre stubs, and a scrap of lace from her mother's wedding gown. Then she picked up her knitting, smiled softly to herself, and began again.